March the 22nd. Ferns, mosses, liverworts and lichens. Fern croziers are at last now pushing up and starting to unfurl. Other species, such as hartstone fern, have kept their leaves throughout the winter and are already producing spores on their undersides. Bracken, Pteridium aquilinum, starts its new growth a little later than most other ferns. The dead cigar-brown fronds still clutter the ground in places like Richmond Park. Being tough, they take some time to decay and look at their best when covered in dew or frost. Being so resistant to decay, they were used as cattle bedding. Beside the hartstone fern, the male fern, Dryopteris felixmas, broad buckler fern, Dryopteris dilatata, and the rarer hard fern, Blechnum spicant, all keep persistent green fronds throughout the winter in our area. On old walls, some long-rooted spleenworts have new leaves pushing through their old tattered ones. On the walls of Lesners Abbey, the maidenhair spleenwort, Asplenium trichomanes, black spleenwort, Asplenium adiantum nigrum, and wall-roof spleenwort, Asplenium rutimeraria, can all be found, as 6 other wild ferns in the woods nearby. Other rarer wild species in London, such as Polypodium vulgare, and shield ferns, Polysticum species, are also producing their spores. Both these ferns used to be in Epping Forest, but now only the latter remains. The giant among British wild ferns is the royal fern, Osmunda regalis, which now exists mainly in gardens and a few wild places such as Wimbledon Common. At this time of year, we can see its greenish-pink croziers with their reddish bloom. The common hortense is also producing its strange-looking fertile fronds among its non-fertile fronds. Its new growth can look like a miniature bright green coniferous forest. There are 5 more horsetails, but these are rarer. The edges of ponds, wet woods, cemeteries and railway embankments are good places to look for them. Mosses. The mosses attracting the eye this month are much the same as last month, except there are more species producing their fruiting bodies, and any new growth is noticeably different in colour from that of last year's. On the tops of walls, the screw moss, Tortula muralis, is producing its long pointed fruiting bodies. These are called sporangia. In this case, each one is covered with a tiny conical hood. When the hood falls off, 32 bright red teeth can be seen surrounding the edge of what has been called the fairy urn. This structure holds the spores. In damp weather, the whole thing twists like a corkscrew, giving the moss its name. When dry, further twisting occurs so that spores can be scattered more easily. Breathing gently on the moss almost instantly causes the urn to close, protecting the spores within. The sporangia of another common moss already seen, the great matted thread moss, Bryum capillare, are now bright green and distinctly plump. Small, brown, hoary cushions of moss on the tops of walls are very common now and often include the grey cushion moss, Grimmia pulvinata, which can produce its fruiting bodies at any time of year. Another species which stands out now but not producing its spores is the silver thread moss, Bryum argentium. The bright days of March tend to dry the moss out, giving it a distinctly silvery appearance. This is due to the fine, long, glass-like tips of its leaves, best seen through a hand lens. This moss is sometimes seen on the rubber surround of old car windows, where it looks like shiny fur. Hampstead Heath is a good place to start getting to know mosses and liverworts in a little bit more detail. Of the 75 mosses recorded there, most of London's most common mosses are present, along with the more common genera such as 2 hair mosses, Polytrichum species, 4 bog mosses, Sphagnum species, 7 thread mosses, Bryum species, 2 screw mosses, Tortuga species, 3 feather mosses, Brachythecium species, 5 bristle mosses, or the Trichum species, 3 pocket mosses, Physidens species, and 8 beard mosses, Barbula species. Similarly, among the 15 liverworts on the heath, there's an excellent range of their different growth forms. For instance, the overleaf Pellia epiphylla with its unusual pale-stalked spore capsules, and the crescent-cup liverwort, Lunularia cruciata, with its odd crescent-shaped cups already mentioned in February. However, there are others, such as the creeping fingerwort, Lepidosia reptans, which has finger-like growth, the Fort Vale Mexgeria facata, which looks more like a miniature seaweed, the bifid cresswort Lophicolia bidentata, which has unusually pointed leaves, and the common pouchwort Calipogea fissa, whose leaves are very round and beautifully overlapped. The dilated scalewort Frulania dilatata even has leaves the shapes of urns, which can contain live pond animals, and the inflated notchwort Gymnocolia inflata belongs to that small group of plants that are almost black in colour. Lichens. A group of lichens that often get noticed this month, particularly on acidic heathland, rotting stumps or covering fallen logs. In woods are the pixie-cup lichens, Cladonia species. These are for all the world like miniature goblets or golf tees. They are usually greyish-green in colour and covered in granules or scales. More often than not, they grow in attractive clusters arising from similarly looking granules on the soil or wood surface. There are in the region of 30 species in London, of which half used to be found in Epping Forest, but not now, although it is still a good place to look for them. As a group, they are difficult to identify, but if you note their size, colour, and the amount of powder or scales covering them, it can help in making a field identification. It is the species with bright red signal tips to their fruiting bodies, the cups, that always get noticed first. So much so, some have even been given some English names, such as Bengal matches, devil matches, or British soldiers, the latter presumably referring to the colour of historical uniforms. In this group, Cladonia polydactyla variety polydactyla is probably the most likely to be found. It is variable but usually has branched, greyish-green vertical stems finishing in bright red tips. Not all the tips are red and few end in cups. It likes growing on damp logs in the wetter parts of woods, where it is often growing with Cladonia coniocrea, which is similar but more worm-like and with no red tips. Together they can form extensive mats covering logs or the bases of trees. The areas of heathland on Hayes Common are a good place to look for the next two species. Cladonia fleurkiana is similar to matches, but having what looks like a drop of bright red sealing wax on the tip of each of its stems. Cladonia macilenta is taller, with smaller red drops on its tips, no cups, and tends to be more bluish in colour. The star of this flamboyant group of lichens is Cladonia diversa. It is slightly more yellow in colour than the others, and usually has wider cups, which often have small projections at their edges, each with a red tip. Most charming of all, like some of the other species, it sometimes has miniature cups within its cups. With a little hunting, this species can be found in Kew Gardens. Among all the green and grey-green pixie cups, which are the ones that are most numerous, Cladonia fimbriata is probably the most common. It often has a champagne flute shape with greyish-green powder on its cups. Beside heaths, it is worth looking for on old walls in cemeteries or even in gardens. It is often confused with the much scarcer common cup lichen, Cladonia pixidata, which is similar and can have brown edges to its cups. The latter species may still be found in Brompton Cemetery. Among the other green pixie cup lichens, Cladonia humilis is noticeably a brighter green. Cladonia squamosa tends to be a lot more scaly. Cladonia porcilium prefers more chalky soils. It can be found on Box Hill. There is another quite different group of Cladonias, often referred to as the reindeer mosses. This is because one species is a major food source for the domesticated reindeer and wild caribou, which even dig it out of the snow in order to eat it. This is Cladonia rangiferina, which is largely confined to the Scottish mountains in Britain. However, we have one or two similar species here in London. They all have highly branched, repeatedly forked stems with many tips and tend to form small cushions on the ground in heathland. Cladonia flocata is probably seen the most, as it is also found in woodland. It is generally less branched than the others, browner and with brown tips. Cladonia portentosa is highly branched, forming dense yellowish-green cushions with tips pointing in all directions. and Cladonia rangiformis looks more coral-like and usually has some scales on its lower branches. All three of these reindeer mosses can be found on Esher Common, along with most of London's other Cladonias.